raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, looking further and further back in time and discovering new paths back to old mysteries and sometimes from surprising directions and places. Coming to you from all corners of space-time, almost live in real time, our cohorts and colleagues, James Waldo and Mr. Jason Pintrail. Jason, how are you doing, sir?
Hey, man, I'm doing great. Once again, Seven Ages Audio Journal. I'm excited about this one. We got a big show tonight. On my end of things, we're just wrapping up a writing project, and we're getting ready for some more field work, looking at the old Carolina Bays once again.
That's right, yeah. Looking forward to doing some work with some friends of ours. I'm sure you'll hear a little more about that in the weeks to come. Also, James Waldo, who is about to go mobile, I hear. I understand you are going to be relocating back to Arkansas, young man.
That's true. Yeah, that's true, Micah. I made the announcement earlier this week. I got a new gig with the Corps of Engineers. My office will be in Little Rock, so be back west of Mississippi, back in my homeland, the natural state.
Yeah, well, best of luck to you as you hit the trail. And, or maybe in this realm of things, we would say hit the pin trail, but we don't like hitting our pal. Be kind.
Man, don't do that. Don't do that. Hey, if nothing else, James, you're going to the Dalton State, so that's always a good thing. There's no shortage of archaeology in that area, so one more place for us to have some adventures, I would think.
Yeah, and you know what else they have a lot of? They've got novaculite.
Yes.
By the dump truck load, man, so I probably
I could definitely. Yeah, it is no fun paying for rock when you're a flint napper, but yeah, that would be great.
Well, James, then obviously what you'll have to do is you will have to legally obtain novaculite and send that back to Jason for flint napping purposes. And of course, that goes for anybody. If you are interested in getting involved in archaeology in your state, we always advise that you do so, but there's a right way to do it. You know, see what the state archaeological societies have to say about it. You know, also see if there are laws and regulations. You know, some states don't allow field collecting or anything of the type. In other parts of the country, you may actually have to have a license. For instance, in South Carolina, where we often do work, you are supposed to have a hobby diver's license to go into the waterways. And furthermore, that not only entails having a license, but also reporting back to the educational system what you find, which helps archaeologists do what they do. So again, when done responsibly, collecting and avocationalist endeavors are, I think, helpful. Of course, there's always ongoing debate about that. But, you know, on that note, guys, we haven't heard from a friend of ours in quite a while, someone who had wanted to call into the recent live show that we did. And because he's doing field work as a professional cultural resource management archaeologist, he wasn't able to join us then, so we've got him now for a narrow window of time. So let's invite into our little sphere of existence for a while a good friend of the program, Mr. Chris Young, who from time to time we would know him as the man. He's really good at what he does, although in other circles some might know him as the wild man. Chris Young, how are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I don't know about all the specialist stuff. I'll take the wild man, but yeah, I'm in northern Louisiana, man. Just it's really hot. There's not much shade, not much soil, a lot of hydric soils here, but they got some really nice rock, and we found a little bit of stuff, so I'm still interested in putting that puzzle together.
Yeah, man. Well, as usual, you've been bouncing around from place to place and location to location, so we just kind of wanted to jump in here with you tonight and talk about some of your latest adventures. So I've been following you, as I always do, on social media, and it would appear you've been having some issues with bears.
Oh, man. So, like the last 2 months, it's been crazy. I was working on a project in Virginia, Southwest Virginia. I have about 150 meters left on my transect. Sit down, take a break, decide not to go in there because it's 10-foot tall blackberry bushes. So I'm sitting on my screen, my two co-workers, and this big black bear just walks out, looks at us, keeps walking down the hill, climbs over a fence and up the power line. And then I guess about a month ago in Louisiana, which I did not ever think I'd see a bear here, there was a bear that came out of the woods, crossed the road, walked down the road a little bit, and then walked into a ditch. And we never saw him again. But, man, I mean, that one was like half the size of a damn Volkswagen Beetle.
They can get big.
That freaked me out. I mean, I was worried about alligators and snakes. I didn't know I had to be worried about black bear, too, you know.
Yeah, well, in Louisiana.
A day in the life of the wild man.
That's right. Yeah, well,
yeah, I know, man.
Well, what's funny is I don't know if they would want me to talk about this just because there is a specific site. This is the thing. In archaeology, if it seems weird to people when we say, you know, we were working on a certain site, we don't want to tell you where it is. The reason why, there are many reasons, but one of them is, of course, you want to protect a site from, you know, sometimes public knowledge, unfortunately, because of looters and people who would try and go in there if it were publicly known. And there are other reasons too, security reasons. One site that we worked earlier this year, however, there were some volunteers on the site who had said that on one occasion they had encountered a large panther or puma on the site. That
Wow.
Yeah, and they said that they had seen it on a couple of occasions. So the hazards that face archaeologists who work in the field, and often rather than in the field, you should really probably call it the brush. I know that there was some interesting stone, though, that turned up in one of your recent, I don't know if it was a field survey that you had done, but you were talking about some of the unique stone that you found while you're working down there.
So I'm kind of close to Poverty Point. So we went over there the second Sunday we were here. But they've got rock that's from like Missouri and Illinois that they're finding here. And we're getting this stuff down here that they call citronelle, jasper, or gravel. And this is what they pave their like gravel driveways with. It's like honey brown or red or sometimes black. And it's just these rounded pebbles that they're digging out of the river, lining their driveways with. And it is gorgeous napping material. They got these rounded pebbles that look like, so you're from Asheville and you know about those ruby mines and
right.
You can go get those rounded rock pebbles out of the mine. Same thing. That's what they look like. They come out of the river.
Okay, I see.
Wow. It's crazy.
So they're finding evidence of similar stone type down there from that period, but something that we would liken to, like what you'd put on your gravel driveway. Okay, I got you.
Yeah. One 2-track road we were waiting to get access to the property on. Just sitting down there looking around. So this one guy picks up a piece of it, and he makes some of the beautiful microflakes, just out of a pebble about half the size of a baseball. It was pretty cool.
Can you call it a pebble, though, if it's half the size of a baseball? That sounds an awful lot to me like a rock.
That's
well, yeah, I mean, you can ask James about the size of stone. I mean, I have this discussion. Every time he says I line my driveway with gravel, well, you know, gravel's a size, not a type, you know.
It is, yeah.
So,
is there
there's actual, classification of grain size all the way from silt up to, boulder size, and then gravel has a classification. What I thought was weird about this was I didn't know there was a natural rock in Louisiana.
Yeah.
I didn't.
I don't know where it's coming from. Well, I'm going to take this back. When we got over to, I think it was Catahoula County and LaSalle County, those have rolling hills and washed out gullies and eroded soils, a lot like northern Mississippi. But it's weird because, and I guess I'm part of what they would call the Mississippi Delta, on this side of the river, technically. I mean, because the soils here are silty clay or silty clay loam, Over there, there's probably some really good prehistoric sites over there. But, I'm limited to such a small area, I don't get to hit it all. So,
and plus, you've got the heat. You're worried about bears. It's probably 100 degrees down there right now.
Well, they're calling for a heat index Sunday, or another heat wave, I guess. The heat index will be like 120. Might be time to cut my hair and shave my beard and start looking like Micah.
No!
The clean cut look. There you go. You heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, I shave my beard in the summertime.
Well, I didn't go all the way Jason. I got to have a little something on top, man. So.
Yeah, that's right, man. There's nothing worse than a sunburnt scalp. I'll tell you that. The last time we were all together was at the White Pond Dig back in March. So, I always like to talk about your life and adventures because I know you have probably more than just about anybody. So since the last time we were all together in South Carolina, how many sites have you worked and give us some of the places that you've been since then?
North Carolina, Virginia for a while. Virginia was cool because there's no humidity up there on the Blue Ridge Plateau, but there wasn't much there. Tennessee was cool. Oh, Tennessee was really good. Back in January, we did a testing. I don't think the site was previously recorded. but we put in a 1 by 1 meter square unit, and I'm not kidding you guys. We took it down to like 130 centimeters, and we got maybe 10,000 artifacts.
What?
It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. It was right on a old creek bed that had meandered, and 40 meters to the east, the soils down there were obliterated, gone, red clay, but there was points down there. But we had 2 shovel tests that had maybe close to 900 artifacts between those 2.
Mm-hmm.
So we put in a unit, and we had a geomorphologist come up there, and we couldn't figure out why every time we went down, then soils would change. It was still sticky, gummy. It was a silty clay loam. We were going down through, like, I think we went through 3 buried A horizons on that unit.
Wow.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
That's like a once in a lifetime unit for me.
Was it a mix of time periods, or were you getting something from like all middle archaic or early archaic? What were you seeing?
Middle to early, but there was a couple. There was what I would call bifacial core fragments in there, and also some polyhedrals. So that might be earlier. But I don't get to see. That's the thing about my job, man. I find it, then it goes to the lab, and I never hear anything about it again unless I ask.
Right.
So in Cowie, we had a prepared floor and big old hearth feature, but if I hadn't asked about that report, I'd have never known what the sherds turned out to be. So,
wow.
It's yeah.
Cowie, I'm actually not familiar with that, so I presume that's a North Carolina site.
It is. It's west of you. It's near Franklin. It's in between Franklin and Murphy.
Yeah.
Kinda.
I got you. Yeah. That's pretty active area as far as archaeology goes. And of course, out in the general direction of a Western Carolina university who has a wonderful archaeology program. Mm-hmm. In fact, we have some listeners there. Yeah.
Before we wrap this up, I do want to ask you, since you're down in that area and you said you had an opportunity to visit Poverty Point, for people who may not be familiar with just how significant that site is, can you give us a little bit of what you experienced while you're at the site there?
I'm probably going to go back. That place is crazy. The effort and the investment that those people put into, and I think it says late archaic. So this might be earlier than Kolomoki in southwest Georgia. I don't know. So don't quote me. I mean, those are things I'm not quite sure about. But
sure.
I mean, it's impressive. The concentric ridges, how the mounds are built and how they were built, is pretty impressive, especially coming from South Carolina where I've seen Mississippi mounds and stuff. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty intense. If you're going down I-20 to Texas, stop. It's well worth the $4.
I mean, I've always wanted to see Poverty Point. There's been a lot written about it over the years, and there are some, what you might call, I don't know, some unusual features at very least about Poverty Point, and which may set it aside from some structures. And again, we're fascinated with all of them. You mentioned Kolomoki. We didn't get a chance to get down there last fall when we were on the road doing our trip. We were being chased by a hurricane, and I'm going to tell you right now, and this is true, I can only think of one force of nature that perhaps is stronger than a hurricane, and that is Chris Young, our CRM correspondent. Chris, is there anything else that you want to impart with us? Any wisdom you'd like to share before we let you go tonight?
Yeah, so all of my fellow Southeastern archaeologists, if you know Kenny Pinson, and you know his daughter Poe, well, she just competed in the X Games, man, and she was in the finals on Sunday, and I got to watch her on ABC, and she did an excellent job.
Wow.
So if you guys want to pull for Poe and support Poe, I'm sure you can find Kenny Pinson on social media. Let's help those two out, man. Kenny's been a solid dad to her, and she's pulling it off, and let's cheer for Poe. So keep an eye out for Poe Pinson.
She's going to be a leader in the field, just like our CRM guy, the wild man himself, Chris Young. Now, Chris, look, when you come up here, like I said, you let me know when you're in Asheville again. We'll go to the Orange Peel and get in some trouble, okay?
Right on, brother. Yeah, man, you guys take care, and good talking to y'all, man. Talk to y'all soon.
We'll see you. Always good to hear from Chris Young, isn't it, guys?
Well, yeah, man, he's one of our favorite people, hands down. He is serious when he's working, but then, he's as serious about playing outside of work. So that's what we appreciate. Great guy.
Oh, yeah. Loves music. And again, for those who are wondering about the Orange Peel, if you've never been to Asheville, North Carolina, where I live, this is one of our premier venues. And Chris Young, in addition to archaeology and history, he loves music. And so if he comes up this way, I do hope to try and take him out and enjoy some good music. We always enjoy hearing from Chris, and we always enjoy, of course, hearing from you guys out there as well. And this week we have an email from Caleb Welsh, who writes, Dear Mr. Hanks and Company, my name is Caleb Welsh, and I am from Jackson, Mississippi. I greatly enjoy the content you and the other members of the Seven Ages team put out. This is especially true since I plan on having a career in archaeology. Now, guys, right there, I've got to say it always lifts my heart and my spirits when I hear from people who are interested in getting into professional archaeology as a result of hearing this program. That is, if anything, maybe the most important thing we would ever hope to try and do is inspire people to take this subject seriously enough to educate themselves in it through formal channels and, get involved. We need archaeologists. We'll never unravel all the mysteries of the past unless we have qualified experts who are working in the field like Caleb aspires to be. So that's great and good on you. He writes, I've also had a good pleasure to be part of the Mississippi Archaeology Association. This group meets the first Tuesday of every month, and we have some sort of speaker do a presentation. Now, as for the topic at hand, I have several ideas that I think would make great episodes or partial segments in your podcast. First, I would like to recommend something about Rome. This is a wide-ranging idea and could take several forms, such as anything from Julius Caesar, the ships of Nemi. These were Caligula's party boats, he notes, that were extremely advanced. And then, of course, there is the story of the lost Ninth Legion, or even the Germanic tribes in the Boudicca's rebellion. Second, he says, I would recommend the raising of the Vasa. It was a 14th century warship that sunk on its maiden voyage, and being rediscovered in the 20th century and due to its incredible state of preservation was able to float into port. Wow, that is fascinating, and I hadn't heard about that until Caleb wrote in about that. The third he writes in is, I would recommend doing something about early aviation, and I would love to do that. In fact, there is almost a hidden history of experimental aviation in the state of California alone, dating back to the 1800s, and that would be a great show. In fact, I would hope that we could do that. And he said this could take the form of something about the Wright brothers, to the advancements made to planes during World War I. Lastly, he said, I'm going to recommend two ideas about my home state of Mississippi. The first is about the Barber of Natchez. Apparently, he was African-American and a slave owner who lived in Natchez, Mississippi before the Civil War. The other idea is about the discovery of a Native American headdress from Mississippi that was used by the tutor for the French royal family in their North American cabinet of curiosities. These were boxed up during the French Revolution and were only recently rediscovered. I hope that you and your team take the time to look over these ideas. Sincerely, Matthew Caleb Welch. Well, thank you very much for writing. We'll certainly take those into consideration. I particularly like that idea about early aviation, and these are certainly subjects that we would like to maybe look at in the future for segments. Maybe odd bits of history would be good, huh?
Yeah, I think that might be a good segment for that. And, it's really kind of ultimate flattery, I guess, for people to listen to the show and, want to get into archaeology. But I also want to remind, listen, kids, geology is also a great field to get into. So don't forget about that.
He's right.
Yeah, for sure. Or we might as well throw in plugs. We'll do environmental science while we're at it, right?
That's
Absolutely.
right.
But hey, you know what, Caleb, again, thank you for writing in. And if anyone else would like to do so, you can always reach us at Micah, James, or Jason at sevenages.org. Remember, you can follow us on all of our Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and of course, Twitter. But hey, we look forward to hearing from you. I think there was some great ideas in there, and most of those I had never heard of. So that's news to me, which is why we want to hear from you, the listeners, because we learn things too. Of course, we're trying to expand Seven Ages on the topics as we move forward. But keep in mind, we do kind of end up focusing on a lot of similar subjects oftentimes because we're directly involved with that research. So we're going to find a good balance for it as we move forward. One more thing to keep in mind is we are coming up on our summertime break here, so we're going to be out of the loop for about the next 30 days or so to kind of get caught up with personal things and some projects that we're working on. But we'll be back with you guys in about a month after this episode is released.
Yeah, that's good to note. We do have some field trips planned. We always try to make sure that our own research and our endeavors to assist archaeologists is what we put the most emphasis on. But of course, that also requires work, travel, lodging, expenses, and things. Podcasts are easy to produce, but it's a multifaceted platform that we offer here at Seven Ages. We hope you guys appreciate it. And of course, yet again, if you head over to sevenages.org, there are ways you can support our work. You'll see all those there at the website. Donations help, but of course, spreading the word, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts and other podcatching clients. Whatever podcast medium you prefer to listen on, consider showing a little love and leaving a review. Those help also. Now, as we move into the next portion of the program, we are very, very blessed to be joined by one of the most distinguished archaeologists probably that we've ever spoken with, Dr. Bruce Bradley. And we will talk more about his background in the interview segment to follow. But I just want to say this right from the outset. Again, we have wanted to talk about the Gault site in Texas for months now with some of the discoveries that are coming out of that area. And Bruce Bradley has been there on site. And again, to have a lithic expert, not just with regard to North American lithics, but also the Paleolithic industries of Europe dating back thousands of years. You know, to have an expert who is so multifaceted is truly unique, and I think that the discussion with Dr. Bradley will probably be one of the most unique that we will have. And, of course, it will also step into the realm of some speculation and even controversy, because Dr. Bradley also was the co-author of a book with the late Dr. Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian, which posited that it is possible that the Solutrean culture of Europe made it to northeast North America, and that there may be archaeological evidence that supports that highly controversial idea. And so no conversation with Dr. Bruce Bradley would be complete if we did not touch on that aspect too, which we hope to do fairly and also with a critical mind. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And first and foremost, the Gault site, I think, is one of the most important sites in North American archaeology right now. It's producing some really incredible dates, and as well as some wide range of lithics. So I think Gault is right at the top of what needs to be discussed in North American archaeology right now. Of course, with the Solutrean hypothesis, for those people who may not be as familiar with it, it is very controversial. But I think it's important to have this conversation with Dr. Bradley, mainly because it has been such a staple of controversy within the world of archaeology. And what I have noticed over the years is through various podcasts that I've listened to and other shows, I have seen the topic discussed in ways that is, frankly, not well researched. And oftentimes the evidence that is there to be discussed is not discussed. It becomes a completely different conversation, and I don't see a lot of people who are really educated on the topic, on the hypothesis, and therefore I wanted to have an opportunity for Dr. Bradley to, for once, be asked the questions directly, and therefore, it's not just replies through academic journals and this person's replying to that person and you have to wait for months to see the reply and all of that back and forth. I said, let's bring him on the show, let's ask him the questions directly, and for once, actually have a back and forth conversation with someone who is at the forefront of the research on the Solutrean hypothesis. Absolutely.
And in fact, I would ask if anyone here who listens to this program today actually recalls hearing Dr. Bradley as a guest on other shows or podcasts. So often we operate in a kind of an echo chamber, not just in archaeology, but really in all different disciplines of the sciences. It is important to not only ask questions, but also allow those who are making the controversial claims, allow them an opportunity to address those things in a public format. And so we endeavor to do that today, and I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation about many different aspects of archaeology, North American, Paleo-Indian, European, and otherwise, with Dr. Bruce Bradley when we return right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. Dr. Bruce Bradley's early research focused on the North American Southwest and Great Plains, where he applied an anthropological approach to much of his work, and since then, his research has included the Upper Paleolithic of Russia and France and horse domestication in Central Asia. He is emeritus professor at the University of Exeter, and his extensive experience with Stone Age technologies and experimental archaeology, and also has co-authored the groundbreaking book Across Atlantic Ice, The Origins of America's Clovis Culture, with the late Dr. Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Bradley is certainly someone who has maybe a finger in almost every pie when it comes to archaeology, and so we are truly, truly glad to have him join us today. Welcome to the program, Dr. Bradley.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Jason.
Well, again, this is a unique opportunity for us. It's so many paths that we could go down with you, Dr. Bradley. You've truly had an extraordinary career and been paramount in so many different areas of archaeological research over the years. But honing it down to a couple of subjects, I want to begin today with your work and involvement with the Buttermilk Creek Complex, the Gault site, the Deborah L. Friedkin site that are part of that complex. Both of these sites are well established. They're known to have archaic and paleo representations, and recently making news for the pre-Clovis finds that have been found there, which we'll certainly get into. But talking about the Gault and the Deborah L. Friedkin sites, please explain your involvement with the site. And I understand that you're the co-principal investigator at the Gault School of Archaeological Research. So how exactly did you get involved with the Gault site, and what exactly is your role there?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. Basically, my involvement with the Gault site came from my close association with Michael Collins, who's he's a principal investigator of the whole project. When the site was first identified by Mike, based on reports from landowners, etc., he went out and inspected it. I was not involved at that point because I was overseas. And through time, he managed to get access to the site through the private landowners, etc., and developed a research project. At that point, I became involved primarily by bringing students from the University of Exeter over to help with the excavations and the research in the lab. And when I could, I was going back and forth. And when I could, I would put myself into the project and work as I could as a consultant, basically. And then after a few years of that, Michael asked me if I would be willing to be co-principal investigator. And I accepted that position with the caveat that I would be overseas most of the time, and I couldn't actually be, running the project at the same time. He primarily wanted me there as a backup, I think, but also somebody to bounce ideas off of and information, etc. And so my role has been more of a consultant than it has been an active co-principal investigator. But I have been include into everything that's been going on since the project really got started.
Yeah.
Oh, very good. So the Gault site itself is pretty large. I understand that the site itself, the actual Gault site, is about 16 hectares, and there's a 3-hectare Clovis occupation there, from what I understand. Now, initial work began there back in actually 1929 to 1930 under archaeologist James Pierce. Right. What is the current level of excavation? Is the entire site still under excavation, or is it just sort of focused in individual areas?
It was the testing scheme was developed by Mike. They did a number of backhoe trench tests because there was so much disturbance on the surface. It was very difficult to tell where intact deposits would be. From that, he found intact deposits of the time period we were interested in, and established a number of test units, so areas we call them. And some of these areas were a test trench that's only a meter wide and maybe 5 meters long, and other areas were bigger open spaces like Area 15, where we've done most of our intensive work, which was, I can't remember exactly, but it was 15 by 15 meters, something like that. Most of the site is still there. We probably have excavated in the known Clovis areas probably 5-10% of it. So there's a huge proportion of that site that's still there. How intact it is, we don't know until you test it and figure out, because the amount of looting that was done between 1930 and in the 1990s, when Mike became involved, was extensive. It was a pay-to-dig site. You paid your $10 or whatever it was and got to dig all day and keep what you wanted or what you found. Most of that was involved with the archaic burnt rock midden, and massive destruction of that happened. But there were still some intact areas that we managed to find. So I'd say probably 5% of the area of the site has been excavated systematically. Now, I don't have any involvement in the Deborah Friedkin site at all. I visited it a couple times, and that's it.
Dr. Bradley, quick question also. Was the fact that, again, the time frame during which the looting would have occurred there, of course, was well in advance of knowledge of, or at very least general acceptance of, pre-Clovis in the Americas. We, of course, are familiar with Dr. Collins' publication about the Gault site with relation to the Clovis layers. And then, of course, we've gone deeper. But is the fact that there wasn't public knowledge or acceptance of pre-Clovis in part perhaps what preserved some of the earlier evidences at that site? People simply, the looters that is, wouldn't have dug that deep.
Well, actually, that's true, but that was true for the Clovis as well. Clovis was not something that the looters got into much. There's a very distinct break in the stratigraphy in the sediments, so that the burnt rock midden is very black and full of rocks and full of flakes and projectile points, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you get down into the earlier material, the pre-Archaic into the Paleo, it turns a different color. The artifacts are much sparser, and people were out there to get things. They weren't out there to spend a lot of time looking for that one piece. So most of the Clovis level was intact, was not disturbed by the looters. One area was dug into by one of the early diggers, and he actually got into the Clovis level, and it was his work that was brought to light to Mike that indicated there may be a large Clovis component. And it wasn't until after we'd been digging in Clovis for quite a long time before we realized there was real good potential for something older. That was really a later thing for us.
Yeah. And briefly on that point, too, before I hand it back to Jason, something that Jason pointed out to me some time ago, of course, was the fact that there was what appeared to be a basal fragment of a red stone that was located in the Clovis layer at that site. Am I correct?
I believe you are. I can't remember exactly its context and whether it was really in good context or not. I just don't have a memory of that particular piece.
Sure. Yeah, we only found it particularly interesting because in the Paleo-Indian database, there are no redstones that are recognized that far west. But then again, of course, many people compare them to Gaines and other points. So, brief notes and aside, but, that was a fascinating aspect of this site, too, because that was a bit of an outlier in terms of where you expect to find that lithic type in the south.
Yeah, there's actually a number of outliers at the site, and they're very, very infrequent, but they're there, and it is a curiosity. So I don't really know how to explain it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the main attractions to the Gault site is not only is it so prolific in the amount of debutage and lithics that it produces, but it does seem to have those very unusual artifacts, which we will get into in a little while. But one other point that I wanted to make about the Clovis level was, can you describe the artifacts that you're seeing when you get down to that Clovis level? Are we seeing bifaces, microblades, cores, preforms? Like, what exactly are you using to designate as Clovis in that layer?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, we find everything we know exists in Clovis assemblages we find at the Gault site. What we do get a lot of, besides the bifaces, which have the classic Clovis overshot flaking, etc., we also have a fairly large blade industry, a struck blade industry, and with two technologies. Now, blades were known from Clovis before the Gault site, especially in the southeast, but primarily from surface collections, etc., and from a couple caches, the Kevin Davis cache and the Green cache were Clovis blade caches, one at Blackwater Draw. So there was a blade technology associated with Clovis, but we really didn't know much about it because all we were getting is the selected finished pieces. And then at Galt, when the excavation started into the Clovis that was intact and in place, we ran across these two blade technologies that are very distinctive and very consistent. Mike wrote a book on Clovis blade technology that he had to modify significantly based on our finds at Galt, which is fine. That's normal. I mean, that's how we make progress. But we also get the whole range of debitage. We get the range of Clovis tools that we see at kill sites, for instance, the big sort of side scrapers, the big biface flakes that have been retouched along one side. They're really not scrapers. They're mostly knives and butchering tools. We get the fine little engraving tools. We get the end scrapers made on blades. We get serrated blades. We get small blades, but not what we would call microblades. Microblades are, for some of us that do a lot of work in real detailed work on technologies, microblades are very specific in what defines them is not just their size, but their technology. A microblade for us is a technique or a technology or a process where the core is shaped to make microblades or small blades. They're not just small blades at the end of a blade core. You see what I mean?
So it refers more to a...
Yeah, we would call those bladelets. So mostly what we have in Clovis when we have small blades are bladelets, some of which are probably inadvertently manufactured during biface reduction. It happens during other kinds of reduction, but it looks like in Clovis our small blades, our bladelets, are actually the end of the big blade process. So they're not making cores specifically to make little blades.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, the true microblade technology isn't that normally found in Alaska or even in eastern Russia, in that area? Is that normally where we associate microblades?
Microblades, when it's dealing with the peopling of the Americas, yes. But microblades were first, the oldest microblades are from South India at about 47,000 years ago.
Oh, very good.
So microblade traditions become the standard manufacturing technique when you get into what in Europe and Western Eurasia is Mesolithic, and the Paleolithic in Eastern Siberia, Russia, Central Siberia, China, South Asia are primarily microblade technologies, yes.
Okay, very good. So I know you said you hadn't really been at the Friedkin site very much, but do you happen to know if that site is producing the same type of stratigraphic results? Are the placements the same as far as the artifacts? Are they there in a similar fashion?
I really don't want to speak to that too much.
Okay, yeah. Sure. If you don't know for sure, that's fine.
That's not really an area that I paid a lot of attention to. It is a different depositional context. My understanding of it is that the Galt site is kind of it's up the creek, up the valley, and the Friedkin site is lower down the drainage. And there's a parcel of land in between these that have not been investigated as private land. I think, from every indication that I can see, that the Friedkin site is a continuation of the Galt site. They're not really separate sites. They're a single big mega site.
Right.
And so what you're getting is the periphery of what I think is the core of the site. Mike does too. At Galt, and then you're seeing the periphery down below, some of which is washed in, some of which is in place, et cetera, et cetera. Generally speaking, the sequence of diagnostic artifact types is the same. So
okay.
It's a much more difficult context, I think.
Okay, and that makes sense. Oftentimes I think these sites, they get different designations and things just because of their location. But I think often, like you just described, they're generally one continuation of a site over a vast area sometimes. Yes. But, okay, so turning our conversation more toward the pre-Clovis side, we've established the Clovis level at Galt. But the pre-Clovis is something that's been making a lot of news here in the last couple of years. Yes. And specifically, we have the Area 15 location that you mentioned briefly a few moments ago. So the 2018 saw a really interesting article from Science Advances talking about the lithic assemblage being found there, and we've touched on some of this already. But the stone tool assemblages, obviously recovered from the very lowest layer there. They seem to be showing two different stem morphologies, and like I said, you mentioned this earlier, but we have them as stemmed and lanceolate. And what I found really interesting about these is it's not something that we see in any other sort of pre-Clovis site that I'm aware of. So give us some more insight on this stemmed and lanceolate type of morphology, and what is that telling us about pre-Clovis at Gault?
Good. This is a real good question because it's a real conundrum, because the stemmed variety that that you mentioned is actually only 2 specimens. Okay, so at Gault, and at Friedkin, that's another thing. So I don't want to talk about.
Right.
I'm familiar with it enough, but we have these 2 very small stemmed fragments of points in the pre-Clovis level at Gault. They're clearly in good context. They go with everything else, but everything else is much more similar to what we think of as Clovis. In fact, the blade technologies are both there. The Clovis blade technologies are both present down there. The biphase technology is very, very similar, but there are some differences. We don't see the massive thinning. We don't see the overshot flaking that seems to be systematic. So when I've heard people talk about the pre-Clovis at Gault and Area 15 as sort of proto-Clovis, and I would almost argue that's the case. I mean, it looks like it's leading into what we see as a more systematic, refined Clovis in biface and blade technologies. The points, now we only have the 2 little stemmed points in a fragment or 2 of possible Clovis points from that level, but they're not Clovis. I mean, they're not fluted like that. But what I think what it means is we just don't know a whole lot about what was going on before Clovis.
Wow.
It is a very interesting thing. What is fairly clear, some people have tried to say, oh, those are just archaic points that somehow drifted down, down through the sediments, fell down a crack and ended up down in the stuff below Clovis. The people that say that are also the ones that don't buy the pre-Clovis context to begin with. But it's really clear neither of these stemmed point fragments that we have are represented in any of the archaic material above. The style, the way they're made, etc., are completely different. So we're very convinced that they are truly associated with that material down below the Clovis level. So, but they're kind of unique. If I had to compare them, just sort of generally speaking, and I don't mean that there's any connection at all. They look more like those things from Ushki over in the Kamchatka Peninsula than anything else. But that's a huge area of the world away, and that material over there is actually younger than the pre-Clovis stuff. So, there's only so many forms of points you can make in the world, and I wouldn't say that they're associated with that. But if you had to compare them to anything, that's where I'd go, which isn't very helpful.
Right.
That's a long way away, and there's nothing in between. So
Right.
Sure, and yeah, that seems to be a paradigm we run into quite often when we're talking about Clovis and pre-Clovis. But something that you mentioned there, and I want to touch on that because I think it's important, because we see this mentioned a lot of times in archaeological excavations, is redeposition of points and things that are moving up or down in the strata. So what exactly is the geology of the Gault site? What type of material are we working in? The pictures I've seen, it looks like it's pretty dense and rocky when you're excavating at that site.
All right. Most of the sediments in the Area 15 are alluvial. In other words, they're water lane. The Clovis level across Area 15 and 12 and a number of the other areas on the other side of the Buttermilk Creek are what are called overbank deposits. And what you're seeing there is periodic flooding of the main channel, which is fairly high energy. But then as it floods the surrounding floodplain, what you get is sediment, real fine sediments, clay sediments that drop out. When you see the really muddy water in a fast-running stream, these drop out, and they're very, very low energy deposits. And that's where most of our Clovis material is in that low energy overbank deposit. So the gravel and things that you see that are in the channel tend to be quite mixed. And that's normal. I mean, you can go out there right now in Buttermilk Creek and find in the bottom of the channel, Buttermilk Creek, every time period that's representative gold, because it's in that high energy situation. But most of the Clovis material has been in this overbank clay. It's very, very fine grained. Virtually anything over the size of a pea doesn't belong there naturally. So the debitage, the flakes and everything are clearly deposited not by water and not by natural phenomenon. So they're actually Clovis deposition. The pre-Clovis is a little more complex, and this is something I know a little less about. Mike is really the geomorphologist out there, and he brings in geomorphologists, Vance Haynes, et cetera, to look at these materials to make sure that we're all on the same page in interpretation, because as you say, it's incredibly important. If these things are coming in and they're getting mixed with later deposits or younger materials are floating down, or what they call, what is they call it? I forgot, percolating down, then you've got a real issue about what is and what isn't what age, you know. But the nice thing about Area 15 is that you've got the whole sequence of archaic burnt rock midden on top, and then as you go down, virtually every known archaeological culture, as we call it, or tradition, is represented in proper order all the way down to Clovis. And you've got a Clovis unit, and then underneath the Clovis unit, you have a deposition that basically has nothing in it. Now, there's a few small artifacts in it, but what we call a sterile unit. And then the pre-Clovis starts underneath that. So if things are percolating down all the way from archaic into the pre-Clovis, you would expect to find those things in all the Paleo-Indian levels, the Clovis level, the level between Clovis and pre-Clovis, and in the pre-Clovis level. I mean, why would something go from way up in the archaic all the way down there and with nothing in between? So we've got this issue of in this sterile level also has virtually nothing in it. So if things are coming down, how are they not stopping there as well? So right. I think the case for this material sort of inadvertently being younger and getting down there is virtually non-existent. You don't see a better sealed context than this.
Yeah.
Dr. Maybe a volcanic flow or something like that. But I mean,
right. Yeah. Dr. Bradley, the fact that, again, that there's such a good argument that there isn't redeposition occurring makes it interesting that people would try to say that what they are finding in the pre-Clovis levels resembles archaic technology. How I would interpret that, and again, you're the expert, so I would err to your judgment on this, but that would seem to make a greater significance behind the idea that Clovis is this industrial revolution that occurs. We see similarities in the working of stone before and after that, but during that period, something very unique was happening, almost as though there is the introduction of a kind of technology. Would that be a correct interpretation?
That is one that Mike and I have published. I don't know if you've seen that. It's an article called Imagining Clovis, where we propose that Clovis isn't a people. It's not a genetic thing. It is actually an idea. And the idea springs from what is already existing in many of the cultures before Clovis. And it's an elaboration and a focus and a refinement of some of the methods of flaking. So we interpret it as our hypothesis, our idea is that it's a result of what we call a cultural revitalization movement. And I would recommend reading that article. It's in World Archaeology, I think. And it's called Imagining Clovis. Maybe I can't remember where it is anymore, but yeah. And this is a way of, this concept is not our concept. This is a concept that was developed by an anthropologist back in the 30s and to the 50s, Anthony Wallace. who came up with this revitalization movement concept to understand the mechanisms that were occurring in movements in native groups, North American native groups, as they were dealing with contact with Europeans and Euro-Americans. And a very famous one is the ghost dance. Another one is Tecumseh's rebellion. These are revitalization movements that happen when cultures get into stress. And so Anthony Wallace defined these things. And I actually was using that as a model for some of the changes that we see in the Pueblo and Southwest, where I also work, to try to explain how cultural change can actually be driven by the culture itself. It's not just necessarily a reaction to the environment, or there's a drought and they have to grow their corn differently, or whatever it is. It can actually be something that's undertaken by the culture itself. And so we have proposed that Clovis, and this helps explain why the spread of this thing is so fast through all these ecological zones that you see Clovis in, from Venezuela to Saskatchewan. And it's relatively fast archaeologically, and it's absolutely identical in Saskatchewan and Venezuela. I mean, this is not what you call adaptation. This is imposing this concept and this technology and this framework, this assemblage framework, on the environments and on the way people are making their living. And the only way that could happen is if there's pre-existing groups out there. And right. Some of which probably had the same ancestral heritage as the group that developed this Clovis thing. So
right. And that makes perfect sense. And it's actually a conversation that we here at Seven Ages have had many, many times on road trips and various other places, where we're talking about Clovis being representative not necessarily of a particular people moving across the landscape, but rather tradition, yes. A technological innovation that was spread throughout existing populations. Because again, we do not see those fluted points that we should in Eastern Siberia like we see here in North America. And therefore, we don't really know where the Clovis tradition began. It could have been in the Southeast. It could have been in the Ohio Valley. It could have been West. We don't really fully understand where exactly Clovis originates, if you will.
Although I speculate that one day we will be known as the iPhone 4 culture. Right?
Yeah,
that's right.
You stop and think about, of course, with complex societies like we have these days, it's not a very good analogy, but genetics do not equal culture, and people adopt languages, they adopt religions, we adopt all kinds of things when we move around, and things do change the world. I mean, the major religions that we have now were both basically revitalization movements. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, they're based on a person that had a vision, that had a story that was convincing, that, et cetera, et cetera. So why should we be surprised that it happened in the past? I mean, in the distant past, it must have done. But the question there is, how do we tease the evidence out of the archaeology? Because all we have is physical stuff to go by. And when you're talking about belief systems, they're not always directly represented by physical things. So, I mean, there are things that a statue of Buddha is pretty clearly Buddhist, but, when you're down into relatively non-complex, I don't want to say simple, that's sort of pejorative, but non-complex material culture, you don't have a lot to go on. And that's why we've put, Dennis and I and Mike and some other people have put so much emphasis on understanding the technology in the greatest detail. Mm-hmm. It's not simply they made a point and they took a flake off the base that makes it fluted. It's how did they go about that? What did it do? And that's why when we get arguments that come against us, well, it's independent invention. Anybody can come up with that. And yeah, that's in every detail by itself, of course, no question. Bifaces are everywhere in the world. But why do we have biface technology as the standard technology of all of North America from Clovis on and before Clovis? when if everybody that came here was making microblades. I mean, there's issues that go beyond just practicalities is what I'm saying.
Well, a question that often is not asked is we always say, well, what did people do to the stone and how did they use it? Another way of looking at that is what did the stone and the way we worked it do to us?
Yes. What does it mean to them?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I can tell you from my own experience with native people in North America, flaked stone objects, very specific ones like projectile points, knives, etc., are very deeply rooted in their symbolism.
Oh.
They're not simply tools. Okay? And it's not every group is the same by any means. There's huge ranges of variation. But as a flint napper, over the years, I've probably produced more points for people, Native American people that need them for their own purposes, than I have anything else. And those are not things I can talk about in detail, but the point being that even if you go back to Jungian philosophy and worldview, you've got basic elements: fire, water, earth, and stone knife.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, and you read Tolkien, and he's got a pool at the bottom of a waterfall that's lined with stone knives. I mean, this is something that goes really deep. And so what I see when it comes down to it, I'm not an environmental determinist. I'm not an adaptationist in the sense that, it stays a little warmer and the vegetation changes, that people had to change their technologies. I don't see that because Clovis technology works in any environment. And
right.
Most technologies will work in any environment. I mean, I work in Brazil now a lot, and we've got technologies some of the earliest ones in eastern Brazil that were coexisting for 8,000 years right next to each other in the same environment, doing the same things, and absolutely totally different stone technologies for 8,000 years.
Yeah.
Now, it worked for them. And I used to tell my students a lot, I borrowed this quote from evolution. Evolution isn't about perfection, it's about adequacy. Technology is not about perfection, it's about adequacy. If it works, why would you have to go any further? But people did go further. They got into very elaborated technologies in stone, none of which was necessary to make a living. So to me, it's a curiosity, and Clovis is a really amazing example. Not just Clovis. When you look at Paleo-American materials, flake stone materials in North America, but also now in South America with fishtails, etc., the amount of effort that goes into making a point to stick in a bison or a llama or whatever it is pretty phenomenal. And I don't mean just physical effort, but skill, training, learning, all that kind of stuff, where all you have to do is whittle a stick sharp at the end and you can kill the same animal.
Right.
So all of this goes, especially when you get to projectile points or lances or knives and things like this that are complex, none of it's necessary. You can make a living without it. In fact, you can look at, there's a really good example, it's in one of our books, I can't remember where, of a big bison kill over in Ukraine that we visited, Androsievka. And there's giant bison primogenus like we have over here, and it's a big kill site, just like the Horner site or any of these other big bison kill sites, the same kind of patterns of everything, and they're using microblades inset into little bone points. And they're killing these big bison with these very simple projectiles. Well, it worked. Why wouldn't you? So this idea that somehow or another Clovis is a technological revolution that gave him superior technology for making a living, I just don't buy.
Right. If I may, Jason, go ahead.
Well, you just staying on this topic of conversation, I just want to kind of make a couple more points because I was thinking about this as you were talking, Dr. Bradley, and talking again about that technology that we see implemented by the Clovis people. Again, we're talking about adequacy. So we know that the Clovis would go to great lengths and travel great distances to get the most premier materials, the best lithics, example in the stone that they could find in order to make these fluted points. And even, again, I'm a flint knapper as well, intermediate level, mind you, definitely not on your expert level, but something I enjoy doing. But I understand, the effort that goes into making a Clovis point. And actually, there's a high degree and possibility of breaking a point when you're trying to flute it. So it could almost be considered wasteful in a lot of ways because of the difficulty of making that type of point. So obviously, it was being done for a very specific reason. But again, we're seeing that sort of tradition. And so my question is this: when we go back to Area 15 at the Gault site, and we have that transitional period in time between what's obviously in a stratified sequence between pre-Clovis and then the Clovis level, is there any indication of a development into that fluted point, or is it just black and white? Like you literally have a pre-Clovis layer and then you have the Clovis. Is there any type of transition that's apparent?
No. There's continuation, and the blade technology seems to change not at all. Across that period. What we don't have is that real massive biface thinning and controlled overshot flaking in the pre-Clovis in the area that we excavated. Now, admittedly, it has to represent what we have, okay, but it's a very small area relative to the whole potential area there. But there is that sort of sterile unit, and it's like that's a hiatus of people being there. There's nothing that looks like sort of preliminary fluting. Now, the one site that we do have that is the Johnson site in Nashville, where we've got it's pre-Clovis in date, although they've got two different dates, and some people don't like the old date. Some people want it to be 9,000 years old instead of 14,000 years old. But you've got multiple biface bases that have overshot or what we call plunging flutes. They struck it at the base to make the flute, but it plunges through and you end up with just the basal piece. So they're failures. But there's a whole lot of those at the Johnson site, which is a real interesting thing to me, even though there's no fluted Clovis points there. So there are potentially places where you're seeing the beginnings of this whole fluting tradition. And why did we start doing it, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so just for clarification for everyone listening, what is the pre-Clovis site dated to? At Gault? At Gault, yes. Okay, there's a publication, Mike, et cetera, and others, I wasn't on it, authored not too long ago, dating, now this is OSL dating, optical stimulated luminescence dating, that's between 16 and 20,000. Yeah. Now it's a fairly deep deposit, the pre-Clovis is. It's not just a little skim of stuff. It's I don't know, 60 centimeters deep or something. So it could have been deposited over quite a long time period. I'm not sure that 5,000 or 6,000 years is right, but it's early. it's not just pre-Clovis. It's significantly older, and we call it. Mike came up with the idea of calling it older than Clovis rather than pre-Clovis, simply because of terminology and how it's taken. The idea of pre-Clovis can be taken as leading into. Now, I think it is basically Clovis, except for a few things. So I could call it pre-Clovis. He would like to call it older than Clovis because who knows what it is. So I just wanted to throw that in. It's just semantics, but it does have meaning.
Well, absolutely. This is so fascinating. And again, I want to remind the listeners that many of you guys sent us the story that we're talking about here, the significance of and the age of this site, Gault in Texas. And keep those dates in mind, 16 to 20,000. I mean, this is incredibly old, and talk about redefining a paradigm. Now, maybe we'll go across the ocean here now, because Dr. Bradley, in 2014, you contributed to a study that provides, and I want to quote from this, from the abstract of this article, it provides, quote, the first direct experimental evidence identifying likely neuroanatomical targets of natural selection acting on tool-making ability. Now, what we're talking about here is that apparently the acquisition of Paleolithic tool-making skills elicited structural remodeling of recently, and this again, we're talking about Homo and our early ancestors, recently evolved brain regions supporting human tool use, which seems to suggest links between brain evolution itself and the stone tool making. Now, that's fascinating to me because coming back to that question, what does the use of stone tool making do to us? We touched already on the cultural significance, ceremonial or ritual significance, the totemic or the iconic essence of what these things meant. But going all the way back to early neurobiological functions and developments in the human brain, there may be connections there too. Could you expound on that a little for us?
Very little. I was the archaeologist and not the neurologist involved in that study.
Sure.
I was the principal investigator. Most of those articles that deal with the brain stuff are really hard for me to understand. But what it boils down to, and I would strongly recommend sometime having a conversation with Dietz Stout. He's at Emory, in Georgia. He's an archaeologist, Paleolithic archaeologist that really got into this, and he was sort of the driving force behind this study. But based on the experimental work that we did, which was over a 2-year time period with a select group of participants in our study, we taught them flint knapping. We came up with methodology to look at how they learned and what they learned. We have 2 different types of learning that we tested. One is connaissance, which means understanding. So you can understand how a Clovis point is made, but you can't do it. Okay. Or savoir-faire, which is you can do it. Okay. We wanted to know what comes first, the understanding and then the doing, or the doing, and then from that, the understanding. Now, it may not be that simple, and in fact, it turned out not to be, but that was the basic premise. But also part of that project, we did brain scans, MRIs, fMRIs, of these participants before, during, and after 2 years of flint knapping experience, and then testing their knowledge as we went along in these 2 different areas. And it turns out that there actually was structural remodeling of one part of the brain, and I don't know all the terms, that we could fairly confidently link to this experience. Now, in modern people, we have lots and lots of different experiences that happen. Some people are musicians, some people do athletics, some people are really good at math, and so we had to have a long enough period of this to actually say there's a good chance there's a correlation between the flint knapping and this brain change. I have to go along with the neurologists on that and just accept what they came up with, because that's completely out of my realm.
Sure.
But there's actually been a lot of work being done on this by quite a number of people. Dietz is probably one of the preeminent ones that's actually an archaeologist, who's continued this work, carried on after this study that we did. The other thing that we found was that this remodeling of the brain isn't permanent. If somebody quits practicing, then it can revert. But there's evidently a tipping point where it gets to a certain point where it becomes hardwired. Now, most of our participants weren't doing it long enough for it to be hardwired. With that change, that physiological change, and we had one student that wasn't up to continuing on. I mean, they stayed in the project, but we had records of every practice thing they did, et cetera, et cetera. And as that one student practiced less and less, then the brain scan showed that. So that was one of the reasons that we were able to say, okay, small sample, but it's very suggestive that there is a link. Now, that physiological aspect of the brain is also in the center of language. It's where language is in the brain. And this is what most people that are studying this are really, really interested in. Does flint knapping ability or understanding actually influence language or vice versa? And I remember not that many years ago, there was a huge argument whether or not Neanderthals could speak. We're now talking about Homo erectus. We're now talking about Australopithecus. based on these studies, not on physiology of fossils. So it's a real fascinating area. It's kind of off on the side, but the reality is there are certain things that one does in education that stimulates brain activity. One of the things my kids were always, why do I have to do algebra? I'm never going to use algebra. Why do I have to study Latin? It's a dead language. Well, it's not the language or the ability to do algebra. It's the development of the brain by going through those exercises.
Right.
That really matters in education.
Yes.
So here we've got these activities like flint knapping, which is very challenging, as you know. Mm-hmm. And some people are naturals at it, some are not. Some have to work really hard. It's like playing the piano. The difference between playing an instrument and flint knapping is you can do the same tune over and over and over again, and every time you bust a rock, it's different.
Yeah.
But, some people, almost anybody can be trained to play the piano adequately, but only a few are going to be masters. Well, I think that's the same with flint knapping. How that relates to the development of the brain, or is it the brain that is already developed that allows them to reach that level? I don't know.
Yeah, or it could be both. And, I'll just interject here also, Dr. Bradley. A lot of this goes back as far as psychology and neuroscience, to the 1960s with the multi-store model of memory. I think it was first proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin, but it was updated in 1974 by Alan Baddeley and G.J. Hitch, and they were the ones that I think first posited this idea of the central executive component in what was called the working memory model. And your study links the idea of, again, articulatory controls, verbal language, spoken language, and also phonological inner ear processes that are linked to the language interpretation to this executive or this central executive component of the working memory model. That's fascinating to me because, again, we're now starting to see how archaeology may help us learn things about these developmental processes in the ancient mind that psychologists identified decades ago.
Yes, archaeology has a lot to offer if we can figure out how to read it and what methods to use and apply and where. Oftentimes people say archaeology is a bit of a parasite. It takes from every other science, etc. But we do contribute now and again to some of these processes. But it is true. We use, virtually anything that exists in human experience can be applied to archaeology. And that's why I think it retains its interest in a lot of people, because no matter what they do in life, it has an application to understanding the past.
Absolutely. With regard to your study of so many different types and developments with regard to stoneworking, you spent so much time, especially in Western Europe, and looking at cultures, the development of stone technologies throughout different eras in that region. So why don't we talk a little about your experience with that? And of course, eventually I want to talk to you about one of the most enigmatic cultures from around 17 to 20,000 years ago, the Solutreans. But let's go back to your interest in Eurasia in general and the stone types and the development that occurs in that part of the world.
Sure. Yeah, I sort of got involved in this whole thing sort of accidentally, like so many things are. Never planned to go to Europe, never intended to be involved in Paleolithic archaeology, but I was going to do Southwestern American archaeology, and that was it. I was so keen on that. But I ran into this fellow, maybe is the wrong term. I met this fellow by the name of Francois Borde, University of Arizona in 1968. He was a preeminent, what they call prehistorian in France, and a flint napper. He was one of these naturals that started as a kid and just started doing it just because he had the urge to do it. And he ended up one of the preeminent Paleolithic archaeologists in Western Europe. And he had a great influence on me, and that's how I got started. Well, I was flint napping first, but that's how I got started in that. And he invited me to come to France in 1970 and work with him for the summer, and I did, and again in 72. And then we kept working off and on together. But he got me really interested in some of the Paleolithic materials, especially in southwestern Europe where we were. And so I started trying to replicate this. He's trying to teach me to replicate it. And realizing that these technologies, although things look a lot alike, things are very similar. When you start sort of burrowing into it, there's a lot of individual choices that really define these cultures. It wasn't just the numbers of scrapers versus the numbers of choppers. It was actually how they went about doing it. And I began to realize that there were a huge number of choices available. And the combination of those choices is what made these individual, what we call archaeological cultures, distinct from each other. So this is where sort of technology started to invade into the whole study of stone artifacts. Till then, it was basically form, this type, this type, this type, but not the process that went into those types. And so from the 1970s on, a lot of that has now come into it. So I got involved in studying the various, specifically Upper Paleolithic, which is the modern human being record in Western Eurasia. And through various and sundry happenstances, I ended up working quite a bit in Russia. And Russian Upper Paleolithic, specifically on what's called the Gravettian, which goes from about 35,000, well, depend on who you believe, but 35,000, 30,000 years ago to about 26,000 years ago. And I was working mostly in Eastern Europe, although this basic technology is what we see that expanded out into Siberia and all the way up into the Arctic, where the Yana culture and all that kind of stuff is basically Gravettian. Gravettian just precedes, in southwestern France, just precedes what we call Solutrean. And you brought that up as being this enigmatic archaeological culture, and it is. It's a very enigmatic, and it's not a single thing. It's a whole range of things, but it forms a cohesion that makes it different from what was before and what came after in the whole southwestern European region. And it's very isolated in terms of its extension. It's basically focused on the Basque Country, which is the Western Pyrenees, northern Spain, southwestern France. You've got a variety of it that goes around the Mediterranean coast of Spain and up into Portugal. Another slight different variety on the north coast of Spain from what you see in southwestern France. But basically, the fundamental difference between all the things that came before and after it in the Upper Paleolithic is the Solutrean had biface technology. This is the technology of making some of their tools by flaking two faces with one edge that goes around. Up until then, most tools were what we call unifacial. You take a piece, it's got a flat side, it's either a flake or a natural piece, and you strike flakes just from one side. Okay? So all Gravettian is unifacial with very, very minor exceptions. There's always going to be an exception. What came before Gravettian, Chateauperonian, etc., is all unifacial. You have Solutrean, which is focusing, it has unifacial retouch, a whole series of tool types, and this bifacial thinning. And it's not just bifacial, it's thinning. And that's a real difference between just making a biface like a hand axe in Acheulean times. 200, 300,000 years ago, they were making, or 500,000 years ago, making things called hand axes, which were bifacial, but they weren't thinned. And that has to do with the width to thickness ratio of the tool.
Right. They were almost like globular in the sense that they were much thicker. They were more rounded. When we begin to see these famous, what some refer to as laurel leaf blades that the Solutrean culture begins to produce, very thin, very elegant, symmetrical, a very different kind of stone tool.
It is a very different kind of stone tool. And the reality is we can't really figure out how it gave them any advantage in any way in terms of making a living. The Gravettian people were making perfectly good living, killing rhinoceroses and mammoths and you name it. And the Solutrean comes along, and they're doing all that stuff with their unifacial tools, but then they have this biface technology. And in many places where you find it, where they were making the bifaces, and I've studied some of these sites in detail and their assemblages, it really looks like they're making bifaces for the fun of making bifaces. I mean, there's very little evidence that they were really important tools. You go to a site like Logériot, which is a big cave site in Les Aisies, in southwestern France, and when they excavated the Solutrean levels, they literally got train cars full of biface flakes. and broken laurel leaves. And broken in the manufacture, broken intentionally after being made. And very few of them, some of them do show evidence of use, but they're not the standard tool that people were making and using. Why were they doing this? Why were they using a huge amount of their resource to make these things, most of which broke? They probably broke as many as Clovis points were broken proportionally, trying to make them really thin and, like you say, symmetrical and fine. It's a completely different mindset to what you see in the Gravettian and what you see in the Magdalenian that comes after it.
That's a fascinating way to put that, by the way, that you say it's a completely different mindset.
Really, it's a different worldview of what you do with stone. And not only the laurel leaves, but the way they make blades. They made blades not as much as the earlier or later, but they made a lot of blades, and they had 3 different blade technologies, 2 of which are distinct from earlier and later. They looked at a piece of stone in a different way. And so their blade, even they're making their blades, they approached it differently than the people before and the people that came after, even in the same cave.
Now, that is extremely interesting to me and perhaps significant. Dr. Bradley, if I may, I would like to ask you a couple quick questions in advance of getting into some of your work with the late Dr. Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian. And just very quickly, the way you described that, it sounds to me like you would argue that this is a very distinctive style of stone tool making. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Very distinctive. You also sound to me like perhaps one of the preeminent experts on this. So I would further ask, if you saw this very distinctive style of stone tool making anywhere that it occurred, you would feel confident in saying that that is most likely what it is. Am I correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, yeah, because there are some controversies associated with this, and the distinctive aspects of this stone tool culture or this industry that you're describing make it all the more interesting in the context of this with regard to the introduction of what we call the Solutrean hypothesis. This is incredibly contentious in American archaeology, especially today. But again, I think that if we're really going to have this conversation, we need to look at what the evidence is that you and the aforementioned, the late Dr. Dennis Stanford, have presented on this topic.
Right.
Yeah, so again, obviously, this is going to bring us back to a very important part of the discussion. And I just want to say that before we get into this, that this has been one of the most hotly debated topics within American archaeology in the last several years. And it has drawn lines, as these things often do, just as when pre-Clovis the idea of this first came out. It caused people throughout academia and avocationalists and everyone else involved to sort of draw lines on what they think about these things. And one thing I've noticed over time is that there's been a lot of discussion, there's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of replies about the Solutrean hypothesis, which we will define clearly here for those of you who aren't completely familiar with it. But very little talk and discussion in a forum such as this, where someone directly involved with the research has the opportunity to answer these questions.
Sure.
So they're returning to the pre-Clovis discussion. This entire idea of the Solutrean hypothesis, it was captured in its entirety in your 2012 University of California Press book, Across Atlantic Ice. This was done with Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian, who has recently passed. And so before we jump into the discussion of the Solutrean hypothesis and all of the associated details, Dr. Bradley, I would like to just give you a moment or opportunity here to talk about your relationship with Dennis Stanford and anything that you would like to say on his behalf, sure. Being that we have just recently lost someone so important in so many ways to archaeology.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, this has been a real adventure, to say the least. Anytime something comes along that's not sort of status quo in science, it tends to get great scrutiny and a lot of reaction, etc. We sort of under this concept or this idea that science is an incremental thing that just sort of goes along and slowly refines and slowly refines. It's not the way it actually works because human beings are involved, the egos are involved, et cetera, et cetera. Dennis and I started working together back in the plains when he was doing some of his excavations out in Colorado in the early 1970s. I sort of got to know him then. He's only a few years older than me, but he was certainly further along in his career than I was. And we just hit it off. Very, very different personalities, different backgrounds, but we just hit it off. He saw the value of looking at stone tools in a greater detail than just saying this is this kind and this is that kind. And so he was a mentor to me for quite a few years. And then I got involved with other people on the plains, George Frizen up in Wyoming, and he sort of took over that role from Dennis through the 80s. And then Dennis and I didn't have a lot of interaction. We were sort of off and on until we got into the 90s. And going way back to my sort of entry into this whole concept of maybe somebody came from Europe to produce Clovis, goes all the way back to my university experience in University of Arizona. I had a professor by the name of Art Jelinek, who was a Western European prehistorian, very close to Francois Borde. They worked a lot together. He encouraged Francois Borde in his flint knapping because Art could see the applications to these things, to his own research. He was the one that brought Francois Borde over to the University of Arizona for a semester as a visiting professor. That's where I managed to get connected with Francois. But Art had seen the Solutrean material, specifically Northern Spanish Solutrean material, Basque material, as being very, very similar to Clovis. And he wrote an article, I think it was published in 72, I can't remember the exact year, basically saying, wow, these things are very, very similar, but there's no way they could be related, so therefore it shows a really good example of independent invention. Okay, I was a student. Okay, sounds good to me. But then as I developed my napping and et cetera, and started looking at in really, really detail at the different Paleo-American stuff on the plains, got involved in the stuff over in Europe, the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, including Solutrean, started looking at it. And I just more and more, I got the sense that this is just so specific. It's just almost statistically impossible that all of these things could be independently invented in the same assemblages. Dennis came from a very, very different background. He did a lot of his work in Alaska, doing his archaeology up there. Not necessarily on the earliest materials, but he was very well known for his work on some of the Paleo-Eskimo and earlier materials in Alaska. But being up there and surveying and looking around, he said, wow, Clovis came from Siberia. They had to come through here. How come we can't find them? And so he spent off and on 30 years looking for pre-Clovis in Alaska. He didn't find it. Nobody else found it. And when I say nobody else found it, what he was looking for was Clovis, because the hypothesis of Siberian origin for Clovis is that it was fully developed in Siberia and came through Beringia, Alaska, down into the continental United States full blown. It was a done deal. It wasn't developed in North America. It was developed elsewhere. That clearly would have left an archaeological signature on the landscape. And Dennis was convinced that he was going to find it. He didn't find it. Nobody else found it. Okay, so he and I got together it was just one of those accidental things. One summer, I think it was in 1997 or 98, got talking around the campfire about this whole idea of where could these people have come from. There's no evidence in northeastern Siberia, Beringia, to speak of. And you got this stuff in southwestern Europe that looks virtually identical. Is looks enough? No, looks isn't enough. We got to understand it in greater detail. So he and I started cooking up this whole idea of resurrecting the Solutrean hypothesis, which wasn't actually a hypothesis. It was just an idea that was discarded. And so we actually started doing the research, doing the work. So we gathered the information from Beringia and all the publications we could from his experience. I did the same with the European stuff, not just looking at Solutrean, but the Gravettian, the Magdalenian, the various sequences over there. And then we got a little bit of private funding to go over. There's no way we were going to get a grant with this crazy idea. So we had a little bit of private funding that took us over, and I started showing Dennis the stuff in the Solutrean collections in France and Spain. And we started recording all this in great detail, et cetera. And from there, we basically came together on the idea that this is a viable hypothesis. This isn't the truth. This isn't the final story. This is a viable hypothesis that can be tested. And that's what we developed. We developed the now called the Solutrean hypothesis. And it's for the origin of Clovis. It's not for the origin of all peoples in the New World, which we constantly get bombarded with. How can you say they're the oldest? How can you say that? We're not saying any of those things. We're not saying it's exclusive. People came from Asia. There's no question. All we were doing was putting together the limited evidence to develop this idea so that we could then further test it and other people could test it. I mean, that's what a hypothesis is. It's not the truth. It's not a story. It's a hypothesis. And it has things that you can test. So that's what we decided to do. We made our first formal presentation of this in 1999 at the Clovis and Beyond Conference in Santa Fe, and were really roundly attacked. I mean, it was an amazing experience, beyond my understanding, quite truthfully, where people were, I mean, colleagues, good colleagues, were just saying, "You're out of your flipping minds." Nobody could have come from Europe. They couldn't get across the ocean. Things just look alike, et cetera, and went from there. And all we tried to do was, basically, good science is trying to disprove something. So you have to have a hypothesis to go out and find the evidence to disprove it. So we kept developing more and more of the evidence. In the meantime, other people were coming up with new sites. Meadowcroft was already in the works. Cactus Hill was in the works. Some of these other, what are now by many of us considered good pre-Clovis sites were actually starting to come out, also being soundly attacked and rejected out of hand. The whole Clovis first thing was still predominant. And we wrote a couple articles expanding on our hypothesis, one in 2004 in World Archaeology. And there's a really interesting story there, but I don't know if we have a lot of time to go into these things.
Sure.
And how we were thwarted over and over again to even get an article reviewed, rejected, unread, et cetera. Eventually, we got it in World Archaeology by the editor of World Archaeology, making a special issue just for debates in archaeology to get around the editor of the volume that wouldn't even read it. And so we published there. There was a rejoinder. Our article was reviewed by 7 international reviewers. Usually they use 3. We made modifications, revisions to it, good revisions from some of the really excellent constructive criticism that we got. We also got ones that just rejected it out of hand, clearly not being read. So we got that published. The next year, the people, several people got together that didn't like our hypothesis, which is fine. They don't need to. They wrote a rebuttal through accidents and no fault of the authors at all, through accidents of the journal. It was never peer reviewed. Okay, so they published that. Then we had a rejoinder to that in 2006 in the same journal. And things have spiraled out from there. In the meantime, all these other things have started to happen. Other sites, not only Monteverdi, but other really potentially pre-Clovis sites, including Galt and Friedkin eventually. Johnson's site, Page Ladson's site, it goes on and on. Interestingly, for us, all of these sites were in eastern North America. They weren't in Alaska. They weren't in Northwest coast. They weren't on the California coast. The closest you get to something that might be pre-Clovis there is the Santa Catalina material out on the Channel Islands. And it just, as the data kept coming in on this stuff, and all of these sites were controversial, highly contested, it just seemed to fill in some of the holes that we needed to fill in our hypothesis in a positive way and supportive, rather than saying that doesn't work because of this.
Dr. Bradley, for the listeners out there, could you explain what the Solutrean hypothesis is?
Sure. That's fairly simple. The Solutrean hypothesis is that during the last glacial maximum between 22,000 and 17,000 approximately, there was this culture called the Solutrean that we just talked about in southwestern Europe, and that somehow or another they managed to get across the North Atlantic during the glacial maximum and establish themselves in eastern North America. And they brought with them their archaeological culture, their technologies, their tools, etc. And then through time, as the ebbs and flows of the glacial maximum happened, there was no longer possible or feasible or reasonable to go across the North Atlantic, and you ended up with a population over here that was isolated from Europe. So somehow or another, people have gotten the idea that we're talking about Solutreans getting in boats and paddling across the North Atlantic in a mass migration. It's not the case. Read the book. We're talking about expanded territory during the glacial maximum, expanded hunting territory, where the Solutreans were looking to the sea and the sea edge and the ice edge, which was annually down into the Bay of Biscay, northern Spain, southern France, and beginning to understand how to exploit those resources, those marine resources, the seals, the birds, the great auk, the fish, and through time expanding their territory from terrestrial looking towards the land to looking towards the sea. And through that expansion of that territory, either accidentally or just through the expansion, ending up finding North America, the northeast coast of North America, which at that time would have been the Grand Banks off of Newfoundland, which was exposed. And then tethering on both sides. And so annually they could go back and forth, exploiting that great grocery store in between along the front of the ice without expanding into North America. And we're not saying that they hit North America and just had a race across like Clovis supposedly did. They didn't need to. They were looking to the middle. And then through time, people got isolated over in the Americas, retained the Solutrean culture, and the people in southwestern Europe that were Solutrean were re-assimilated or resubsumed into the non-Solutrean cultures over there. As Europe opened up and the people expanded out into Europe, it became sort of the pre-Solutrean again, which we call the Magdalenian.
Okay. So for the lithics that are peculiar to the Solutrean people, theoretically, is there the source of the lithics? Is it all North American source material, or is there evidence that some of this material made its way from Europe to North America?
It's a good question. Right now, as far as we know, it's all North American material except for one piece. And there are some issues. It's published in our book. There's some issues with that piece, but I think we can make a very strong case that it's actually originally from southwestern France. The stone certainly is. The artifact certainly is. It was the context that's at issue, where it was found and how it was found. It's a Solutrean laurel leaf made out of French flint that was found in the first terrace of the James River, a place called Epps Island, during an excavation of a 17th century, early 17th century homestead. But anyhow, other than that, so far all the pre-Clovis material that we have on the East Coast, as far as we know, is local material. Some of it we know is definitely local material, like the Sinmar biface,
right,
and some of the other things. There's black chert in a lot of these early sites, like at Parsons Island, Mills. I just lost the name. Doesn't matter. Some of these other sites in the Delmarva Peninsula, a black chert that we haven't identified. It could be out of the Susquehanna River gravels. There is some there. It could be that, but the dominant chert source on northern Spain shore, called Barista, is a black chert. Now,
okay.
So there could be some. There could be. It hasn't been tested adequately. It's very difficult to identify sources of chert chemically.
Right.
We're in the process of doing some of that now. I've got samples from Spain, and we have the samples from Virginia and Delmarva, etc.
Yeah, I would be interested to know exactly how it was typed to a locality, because, like you said, chert and flint are notoriously difficult to determine the source of, because the mineral or the rocks is pure silica, so it doesn't. There's not a lot of differentiation. But if it had some kind of other inclusions or some other feature, it would make it easier to type it from place to place.
Yeah, sometimes fossils can help you, but you can't get exact sources, but you can get like geological formations.
Yeah, right.
Now, there's geological formations in northern Spain that are different from the geological formations in northern North America. So chemically, it may not be feasible, but there may be other ways. And we're just trying. We don't know. And if it is, it is. And if it isn't, it isn't. That's fine. It doesn't matter. We're just trying to test the hypothesis.
Absolutely. And, Dr. Bradley, we don't want to take up too much of your time, so we're coming down the other side of the hill here, just letting you know.
Yeah.
But that said, I do want to kind of stress to the listeners that there is a lot of controversy associated not only with the idea that you and Dennis Stanford articulate, but the history associated with this idea, which is, and we will acknowledge, and most would, that it's an unfortunate history. There had been this sort of appropriation of this idea when it was first presented as being evidence, and interpreted by some wrongly, of course, as having been, people, Caucasians, were the first ones in North America.
Right.
I understand that's not what you guys are offering. I've also seen many prominent skeptics point out that to assume that Solutreans might have made their way to northeastern North America, that is not a controversial idea per se. There were probably many migratory routes. The problem is the way that some people have used this hypothesis, especially in decades past, and the ideas they appended to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, I want to make that distinction because I think some, unfortunately, have seen a stigmatization, whether or not they're aware of it. The idea has become stigmatized because of that, and therefore you actually have, a lot of political talk about the Solutrean hypothesis. And, as to quote Dr. Bradley Lepper, he said it's a strong word, but, you could use it. Some would say it's racist. What do you have to say about people who have argued that to say that Solutreans might have arrived on land, hunted in North America? What would you say to people who say that there's a racial component to that?
There could be a racial component to that, but it isn't. We've been involved with the genetic aspects of it too. We're not saying anything about. First of all, 20,000 years ago, they were not Europeans. Okay, the Indo-European expansion, as far as genetics, did not happen until the Neolithic. Much, much, much later. These are Paleolithic peoples. If anybody that lives in Europe now is a direct descendant of it, it's probably the Basques. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Basques. It's irrelevant to us what their genetic background is. We're in terms of race. I mean, it's a spurious thing. I mean, when I first proposed this idea to some of my Spanish colleagues, they were horrified. They were horrified at the idea. They said it's irresponsible to even suggest this. Well, they were being racist, right? Because they were saying, oh, this is somehow or another going to mean that you're suggesting that white people came over and were here before the Native Americans. Nonsense. We're saying nothing like that.
Right.
Okay. I mean, we now have Native American groups in the northeastern part of North America who are adopting our hypothesis as one of the ways of reclaiming some of their own heritage. I mean, who are we to tell them they can or can't? It's nothing to do with us.
Right.
Things have, but those political things are kind of like, okay, here we got archaeology. We're talking about science, quote unquote. We're using scientific method to look at the past. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter where it leads us. But we've got to look at it with open eyes and not sort of burden it with all this politics and et cetera, et cetera. I want to see the genetics. I want to know what the genetics are, but genetics are not culture.
Right.
Okay? Yeah. people in China wear blue jeans, I mean.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about genetics for a moment also, because again, I'm with you. I want to look at what the science has to say, and I'm not going to endorse this hypothesis or any other and say, well, that's what I believe. I, as an individual, try to leave belief out. I want to look at what the evidence entails. Now, we do have good genomic evidence that, again,
yes,
there were plenty of migrations, at least a couple of waves likely, that came across Beringia. And, of course, we can trace the ancestry of modern Native Americans to Asia as well. But we also, if we go back into the 1970s and we look at the reasons for the first genomic sequencing of mitochondrial DNA, and we find the haplogroup types A, B, C, and D. And this was the basis for the evidence for the ancestry, the lineage, the migratory patterns, etc. We understand that there are also the outliers in the genomic data, which in one of the papers you and Stanford co-authored, you did talk about the controversial, I will also call this enigmatic, haplogroup type X, and more specifically, I think actually a subhaplogroup mutation that you guys reference in the paper. But the point I want to drive home here is that some genetic data, again, I think that we're talking in a margin of like 3 to 5% of the North American, Native American population, but nonetheless possess this haplogroup X. And one interpretation is that actually could have come from this region of the world that we're talking about. Am I correct in my understanding?
That is correct. There have been a lot of articles now about the genomes of Native Americans, although they almost all leave out North America because of political things.
Yeah.
They talk mostly about South America, etc. They deal with that. And X2A, and we can't get into all the detail on this because it's not time, is a North American mutation. X2A happened in North America. It exists nowhere else. Okay? If you use the same genetic clock that they use for A, B, C, and D, it puts it between 18 and 22,000 years ago. X2, from which A mutated, is a Western Eurasian haplogroup. It does not occur anywhere east of the Altai. The small unit of X2 that occurs in the Altai is a very, very small founding population that dates 2,700 years ago. Okay, if X2 came to North America, specifically northeastern North America, across Asia and Beringia, it did so without leaving any trace. Okay, that's not the case with any other haplogroup. Every other haplogroup has left traces.
Right.
So, and we wrote an article with Stephen Oppenheimer, Dennis and I did, called Solutrean Hypothesis, Genetics, the Mammoth in the Room. Because the geneticists, with the archaeologists' input, have consistently ignored X2. Consistently ignored it. Or they said, it came across Asia and got to North America that way without leaving a trace. Well, the problem is they then agree that it's a North American genetic mutation. So how could X2A come across Asia?
Well, it's a good question. And Dr. Bradley, we know of extinct haplogroup types that are no longer present, but we can trace them. And we also, how else would we have knowledge of them? With the case of X, what you're talking about, and actually I'll quote from the paper that you just mentioned, the mitochondrial DNA X2A evidence is more consistent with the Atlantic route and dates suggested by the Solutrean hypothesis and is more parsimonious than the assumption of a single Beringian entry. By that, of course, meaning they didn't all come this way. It was multiple migrations in likelihood. But you further note that also this would, rather with regard to the other hypothesis that they come across Beringia, you note that this also has to assume complete retrograde extinction of the X haplogroup in East Eurasia.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think it's those are some fair points that you raise. I understand why the controversy has ensued, but again, there are some very valid points I think that you raise in that paper and of course in your book. I think we're kind of winding down. Jason, James, do you guys have any other questions? I think I'm pretty good with what I've got right there.
I do have a couple things here, and I'll try to make this brief.
Go ahead,
But I really want to explore more of what we're calling the evidence for the Solutreans in North America. So we've talked about the genetics, we've talked about the general idea of how they got here, but The hotbed of controversy seems to be a lot of the lithics that are being discovered in and around the Chesapeake Bay area, Maryland. The story of the Sinmar biface, that's the rhyolite lithic that is on the cover of Across Atlantic Ice. And for those who aren't familiar with the story, the Sinmar biface was discovered by a scalloping dredge boat offshore, and that was brought up with mammoth bones that were in a museum for many, many years before they were discovered. And ultimately, we see this very large rhyolite biface that is laurel leaf in shape and very thin. And I'll let you pick it up there, Dr. Bradley. What exactly is the Sinmar, and what role does it play in establishing evidence in North America?
Okay. The Sinmar, as you described, it was actually a mastodon, not a mammoth, but was because it's dredged up off the continental shelf, came up in a net with the skull, does not mean it's associated with the animal. Okay. Right. We certainly attest to that. However, one has to make some really bizarre arguments to have that particular item fall exactly where a mastodon carcass lay by accident. I mean, you'd have to have hundreds of thousands of these things laying around on the continental shelf for that to happen. Okay. It was challenged in print, which is fair enough. It needs to be challenged. But the challenge from our point of view doesn't hold up. We cannot make the arguments against that. But it had the Sinmar biface is not just a rhyolite laurel leaf-like object. Technologically, it is. It has Solutrean technology, which can be seen not just in Solutrean, but some other later things occasionally. It also has a very interesting life history that Darren Lowry pursued and did geochemical analysis to find that this rhyolite piece had been inundated and in a saltwater marsh for quite a long time because of chemical alterations, and then it was exposed from the saltwater marsh and oxidized. And where it was found, the youngest it was inundated was 14,500 years ago. That's the youngest it could have been under the seawater, but it also had to be there long enough for all these things to happen to it, the chemical weathering to happen to it. But it's also still in very, very good physical shape in the sense that we can look at it, and we did look at it under microscope and find use wear, evidence of hafting, evidence of reworking after being used. It was used as a butchering tool. So it means it didn't wash down the river. It wasn't on the beach in the surf, et cetera, et cetera. It's pristine, except for this chemical weathering. The mastodon was dated, and we also did isotopic work to find that it was a sea edge grazing mammal. It was eating C3 grasses, so it had to be along sort of the beach area, and it dated about 21,000 years ago. Now, okay, that's a single example. We think it's very strong. We need to go back out and recover what's there. We know where it is. We know what it looks like, but we've been thwarted for going back out there, and we won't get into those stories.
Sure.
This is not the lone example of this kind of thing that's been dredged up on the continental shelf. There's quite a number of things over the years, and lots of mammoths and mastodons, and a number of stone knives that are laurel leaf-like. And they do not count, contrary to what was claimed by the article that said that these things occur at a later time period. They do not occur at a later time period in that whole sort of mid-Atlantic region. And when I say they don't, biface laurel leaf knives with that technology don't. Okay. So anyhow, that's one of the examples. And then we have the other sites along the Delmarva Peninsula, Chesapeake Bay. Remember that at glacial maximum, when these sites were occurring, when they were being established, this was not the edge of the ocean. This was a highland area above the Susquehanna River drainage. And the artifacts that have come out of these sites, Miles Point you mentioned, in context as well as washed out, produce a very, very consistent assemblage of materials that include virtually every single Solutrean type and technology. And later materials do not in that whole area have those combinations. So, I mean, I can sit down and give you a list of the technologies as well as the tool forms that occur in those sites, specifically Parsons Island. And it's virtually everything that you see in western, southwestern France, Basque area, Solutrean.
We won't make you list them all right now.
Yeah. A couple of years ago, we actually went to Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and met with Dr. Edivazio up there, who was kind enough to do an interview with us on site. And one of the things that he said to us really stuck with me, and I think it's important for people who are scientists or work towards these type of things is just to follow the data where it goes. And what he said to us, basically, I'm kind of paraphrasing, it was he said we weren't interested in the cake that we were making that was the outcome of this. We were interested in the process of making the cake.
Yeah.
And how it came out was incidental to the process of following the data.
That's absolutely correct. And the only thing that Dennis and I would like to have done is people use the same criteria when evaluating the data. It's very, very interesting that some people can say, oh, the ducti and the Denali are related because these tool forms change to these tool forms, and you can follow the way that works, and then turn around and say Solutrean and Clovis pre-Clovis are independent, because if they use the same logic, they wouldn't say that. And this is what's been so frustrating in this whole thing, is it's like a double standard. If it's a controversial concept, you use the data differently. You use different methods, or you don't accept the methods. But when it's not controversial, you just use the methods and say, here's the result. Yeah. So follow the data, but you've got to not only follow the data, you've got to do the same method. You can't adjust your methods to prove what you want to prove. It doesn't work that way. It shouldn't work that way.
Yeah, that's an acceptable statement, a very, very respectable position, too. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for taking so much time to go deep with us on this subject. This has been truly an enlightening conversation. I hope it won't be our last one with you here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Oh, I hope not, too. And thank you, Jason, James, and Mike. I appreciate it.
Special thanks again to Dr. Bruce Bradley for taking the time to go extensively into all these subjects with us. And although there was so much that we've discussed with him, ranging from the Paleolithic industries of Europe to new discoveries at the Gault site, one thing that the team and I have anticipated is that probably there will be a disproportionate amount of focus placed on the latter part of the discussion having to do with the Solutrean hypothesis due to its controversial nature. And so I just want to add a few things here about that, why there is such controversy, and I think the reasons for the conflicting opinions about it, and also maybe some concerns that are derived from that. Because as Dr. Bradley stated there toward the end of the interview, what seems to be occurring, and this is both maybe a social and also a psychological phenomena within archaeology, but what seems to be occurring at times is that when a controversial idea is proposed, and it ruffles feathers and people are uneasy with approaching it or accepting the implications of what it may entail, there are different standards for research. Now, again, fundamentally, I try to root myself in skepticism. Not to say that I'm a doubter or disbeliever, but a person who needs good evidence before I commit to saying that this is what's most likely. I think that good skepticism must be maintained at all times, especially in all areas of the sciences. and therefore claims which may fall slightly outside what is generally accepted as immediately credible. In other words, extraordinary claims, as has often been said in the past, they do require evidence that is in equal measure in support of those extraordinary claims. You have to have a whole lot of really good supporting data. But what you do find from time to time is even when there is data put forth, sometimes rather than being held to scrutiny and then irrefutably disproven, it is simply ignored. And that presents a lot of problems, especially if, in terms of science, we are trying to follow the data exclusively and not politicize or become beholden to ideological perspectives on things. Now, in addition to that, although we have an environmental scientist and also a professional geologist on this team, my background is in media. And so I want to offer a journalistic perspective on this, because as producers of a podcast that covers a wide range of different discussions and topics pertaining to history and archaeology, our job here is to report. But in reporting and also in following what I think are both credible and fair standards of journalism, you also need to allow the person who is the subject of a dispute or a debate to have their say. Any good journalist will tell you that. And again, I want to make that distinction that we're talking about journalism in the context of the fact that we as podcasters are reporters. In scientific journals, things are a little different. Stanford and Bradley publish a paper, then there's a rebuttal published. The team and I understand that, but in the context of what we do with this podcast, likening that to how journalists treat these subjects, it's only fair to have this person join us on the program. And of course, since Dennis Stanford is no longer with us, Dr. Bradley is the person to talk to about this subject. So in the spirit of fairness and offering him a chance to discuss this, we felt it was imperative to do so because we hadn't seen this occur anyplace else. And many friends of ours in the archaeological community have confided to us that due to the way that this so-called Solutrean hypothesis has been politicized, there are some archaeologists who have been offered opportunities to do field work that may render further evidence in support of those claims, and they won't touch it because they are concerned about what it could do to their careers. Now, therein, my friends, lies a real problem, because if we are unwilling to look at certain evidence because they have become simply too controversial, and therefore, like the proverbial ostrich, we put our head in the sand and ignore the data, that is indeed a real problem. And I think, again, in fairness to Dr. Bradley, we wanted to have him on the program and give him a fair opportunity to speak. Unfortunately, there are some commentators that involve themselves in such subjects that think that to allow a person like Dr. Bradley to have a say somehow compromises their own objectivity, and they resolutely refuse to communicate with people about their ideas before they attack them. And I can assure you from the journalistic standpoint that anyone who thinks that it is fair to report on something that someone has said, attack them unfairly, engage in ad hominem attacks, and resort to what is tantamount to high school bullying, while offering no opportunity for rebuttal or further dialogue, again, in the world of journalism, that would never be taken seriously. So I think it's important to understand how the scientific process works, how peer-reviewed publications often disagree, and that's a professional disagreement, but that's very different from lobbing grenades at people and offering no chance for them to defend themselves against the attacks. Hopefully, in the spirit of fairness and honesty, we have allowed Dr. Bradley to do that here. Now, it is also equally important to address the reasons why, in part, the Solutrean hypothesis has become so contentious by today's standards. And I actually want to refer to and quote Sarah Head, who is a friend of the program and also someone who has been a past guest. She's also the host of the Archae Fantasies podcast, and we had her and Dr. Ken Fader on the podcast a while back to discuss pseudoarchaeology. And I'm not inferring, by the way, that the Solutrean hypothesis is necessarily pseudoarchaeology. Some people see it that way. My point is I want to quote someone who comes from a more critically minded and skeptical perspective on this subject and what she had to say about it, because I think that what she said is very important. And to quote Sarah at her blog, she says that when the hypothesis was first put forward by Bradley and Stanford, it was not warmly received. In the 20-plus years since, things haven't changed. But she goes on to say here, I want my readers to understand. Doctors Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford are both respected archaeologists. Both are authorities in Paleo-Indian topics, including stone tool technology. Dr. Bradley retired from his teaching positions at the University of Exeter in the UK. Dr. Stanford works with the Smithsonian National Museum in the Department of Anthropology. It is their hypothesis that is being critiqued here, not the men themselves. And I will not encourage any negative feedback against either man. Good on you, Sarah, and that's something that we appreciate about her and Ken Fader and so many of our friends in the community who are taking a skeptical look at these subjects because they understand the difference between attacking an idea and attacking a person. Some people don't. I think it's important that we make that distinction when we have these discussions. But she also raises a number of issues with the Solutrean hypothesis, and some of the points that she raises are, one, dubious existence of the ice shelf that would have been necessary for the Solutrean people to cross in enough numbers to populate the area. Now again, I want to borrow a term that has been used by friends of ours in southeastern archaeology. Maybe there is the possibility that some of the Solutrean lithics that have been found constitute what could be called a failed migration. It doesn't necessarily mean that people came across Atlantic ice and stayed here. But then again, the genomic data that Bradley and Stanford have argued previously, in their interpretation, seems to suggest that there would have been people who stayed, and at least in great enough numbers, to leave their mark, genetically speaking. And while there's much more that could be said about the genetics of all this, which unfortunately we haven't got time to get into right now, I will say this, that perhaps the idea of the ice shelf existing and questions about whether it existed and whether people could have crossed that, again, is not so difficult to understand, again, if we are looking at something similar to what we're already considering with regard to the Beringia idea, which is that people might have utilized watercraft to aid in making that passage. So again, if people were doing it from Eurasia into North America, it seems likely that people probably were able to do that coming from Europe, and that's a big if they made their way to North America. Let me remind you again, it remains unproven. Another point that Sarah raises is that the Solutrean subsistence patterns suggest that they were opportunistic hunters and not in possession of advanced foraging skills necessary to supply food for a journey like this. But again, maybe looking at an alternative idea there, many have suggested that again, these Solutrean hunters, being hunters as they were, could have actually been hunting as they made their way over. In fact, it may not have been the intent to cross the ocean and say, let's go over there and see what's over there. They may simply have been in pursuit of animals, of food. In other words, it's not impossible that there may have been circumstances where their natural pursuit of game actually led them over into northeastern North America. And they weren't looking at it like, well, we're going to go across the ocean and see what's over there. No doubt that never even entered their mind. And of course, it isn't until the historic period that people are driven by the curiosity and the desire to explore in and of itself, rather than the quest for sustenance. I think that should be kept in mind also. Sarah's final point, the issue of radiocarbon dates not overlapping as they should, as well as tool production technologies not showing progress as we would expect. Now again, these are all fear points that she raises and that many others have raised as they attack the idea, not the respected archaeologists like Dr. Bradley who propose it. But again, I think that if more people were willing to put their reputations at stake, and it's sad that they feel that they are, again, endangering their careers by pursuing these lines of inquiry, but if more people did it, perhaps we would find more data that would also reconcile that third point. Now, of course, another big issue, and we touched on this very briefly with Dr. Bradley toward the end of the interview, has to do with the Sinmar biface. Dr. Bradley, being an expert on the Solutrean lithic industry, feels confident that that is what this biface represents. And he also feels that arguments that have been made against the Sinmar biface, being Solutrean in origin, actually don't meet the standards of data in terms of how likely is it that this lithic, looking like it does, with its similarity to the Solutrean lithic types, how likely is it that it would be found a good distance off the coast and in apparent association with megafaunal remains? You know, others have said, though, well, we don't really have enough data in support of the discovery. We don't even know if the sailing vessel that allegedly dredged it up even exists. You know, we've got friends in the archaeology community who have raised that point, too. Now, I believe that there is plenty of data that does, at very least, establish the provenance in terms of how the item was found. But perhaps, again, more important than what it is and what it is not is the varied responses to it. Again, if you found something that was far less controversial, but under similar circumstances, would anyone be asking questions like, did the sailing vessel ever actually exist? Do we have records of the vessel actually being at sea on that date at that time? Again, people wouldn't hold them to the same scrutiny. And I think that for Bradley, he feels that that is a double standard. Maybe it is. But again, from the skeptical perspective, I also understand that if you're going to make extraordinary claims, we do kind of have to hold those to a higher standard in order to prove what is being claimed. But now the biggest issue in modern times with the Solutrean hypothesis has to do with a complete misunderstanding of what it would mean if Solutrean hunters had made it to North America. Again, we've touched on it, but I want to reiterate here. Sadly, some people with extreme views, nationalist and frankly racist opinions, they misinterpret the idea of Solutreans coming to North America in ancient times as meaning, well, whites were here first. Well, that is a complete misunderstanding. First of all, the Solutrean people would not have been white as we would define it today. And the fact that they came here in no way supports the idea that somehow, again, Caucasian people were here on the continent first and that they have some claim to North America. But you can see how that erroneous interpretation and then further the promotion of that idea, wrong though it is, you can see how that causes a lot of issues when it comes to the actual heritage of First Nations people. And this is something we've addressed in the past on our two-part program of the American Holocaust series on this podcast, understanding what the plight of the indigenous peoples of North America has been. So when you have people who come forward and they say, this is what we want to believe because this gives us a feeling of strength and superiority, yeah, that's obviously a problem. And to paraphrase something that was said on this show by someone we truly respect, Dr. Bradley Lepper, when he came on the program, he had said, again, it's a strong word, but sometimes it must be used. And yes, people who promote that erroneous interpretation of the Solutrean hypothesis are doing it with a racist mentality, and hence, in part, why it has become so controversial. But the idea itself is not racist. Sadly, some racists have adopted the idea. We need to distinguish the bad idea from what the data actually may entail. We need to destigmatize and just look at the facts, look at the science. It's very unfortunate, though, when an idea that otherwise might be even revolutionary becomes so hotly debated and so unfairly stigmatized due to a horribly erroneous misunderstanding of what the actual theory entails that even academics become very cautious, hyper-aware of what might happen if they become involved in that kind of research. So again, both in the spirit of sensitivity, understanding the necessity for that in the anthropological discussion of the 21st century, but also in fairness to researchers like Dr. Bradley, who have been brave enough to say, look, I only want to look at the science. I only want to see what the data actually shows. I don't want to try and politicize this. I merely want to know the truth. Again, I think it's only right that we allow for him to have a fair shake at this, and hence why we had this discussion. Of course, we always invite feedback from our listenership, info@7ages.org, or you can email any of us individually, Jason, James, or Micah at 7ages.org. It is, I feel, and I think I speak for my colleagues here too, important for us to have this dialogue and to further this discussion as long as we do it responsibly and with a mind for and an awareness of the fact that in the end, once we all come to a consensus on what we believe has happened, we are willing to accept that in terms of what science actually has to say about this, not biases, not beliefs, and not any hopeful desires or predispositions towards certain ideas. We want to be scientific above all else. So, gentlemen, I think it was a great conversation, and I want to thank you, as always, the two of you, for being here and being a part of what we do together as the 7 Ages Research Associates.
As usual, another great interview, great conversation. I like these kind of edgy subjects like this that, it's kind of controversial because they're fun to talk about. But, this day, this evening has been basically as long as a life age of the Earth. And I think we probably ought to put a bow on this thing and call it a night. What do you say?
James, I only would add to that, and I think, Jason, you would concur, if you will join us for one more round at the Cross Time Bar.
You know I will.
That's right. Jason, I'm sure you've got one more in you, right?
Oh, of course. It's still early. We can do this.
It's early, well, somewhere, right? Yeah, folks.
Time's relative, right?
It is indeed. Folks out there always ask, where is the Cross Time Pub? It's someplace out there, perhaps even in the human imagination, somewhere in time. And that's where it will have to remain for now, or maybe I should say for the time being, but we invite you guys always, every week, to join us on the journey as we look back into history and try to understand the human past. I am Micah Hanks, he is Jason Pentrail, and he is James Waldo, and together we are the 7 Ages Research Associates. We will catch you guys again next time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.